Day of rage, burning fury in the streets of Egypt. Brutal battles with police. The U.S. says the regime must respond. All eyes now on Egyptian President Mubarak tonight. The world is watching this tense, violent, and fluid situation. Question is, how does it end? Nightly News begins now.
From NBC News World Headquarters in New York, this is NBC Nightly News with Brian Williams.
Good evening. There's something enormously important happening half a world away from us tonight. The nation of Egypt is probably changing forever, and it may not stop there. What appears to be a revolution is underway, led by protesters in the streets against the almost 30-year rule of President Hosni Mubarak. And late tonight, local time, he went on television. He gave a speech talking about freedom and democracy, saying he is replacing his own government tomorrow. We later learned when President Obama made his own statement tonight that the two had spoken for 30 minutes late in the day. Egypt has shut down the internet, which helped fuel this, after all, in a nation where over half the population is aged 30 and under. And importantly, this is not a Middle East protest against the U.S. or Britain or Israel. This is Egyptians protesting their own government. Here's where we're talking about. 3 major protests going on in 3 big Egyptian cities: Suez, Alexandria, and of course in Cairo. That's where our chief foreign correspondent Richard Engel is standing by tonight. Richard, good evening.
Good evening, Brian. The Egyptian army has deployed in much of downtown Cairo, and President Mubarak has broken his silence and promised some reform. But will that be enough to stop these demonstrations? Egypt is now in a state of revolt. Waves of thousands of protesters rushed riot police, who drove them back with water cannons and, more often, tear gas. Although the protesters have no single leader, the demonstrations were coordinated to begin at mosques. The clashes started almost immediately after Friday prayers. The protesters, now calling themselves revolutionaries, launched bottles, stones, and Molotov cocktails. They tore up the streets to throw blocks of pavement at riot police. Several hours into these protests, there is now nothing less than chaos in the center of Cairo. This city has not seen anything like this in decades, if ever. Downtown Cairo smoldered with anger and the debris of torched police vehicles. The crowds are continuing to grow with every hour here. They are now chanting one simple slogan: God is greater. And they hope to continue this protest until they topple Hosni Mubarak.
I want another president for Egypt.
I take freedom today! I take freedom today!
Tonight, President Mubarak went on national television and defended the crackdown, but also offered concessions, firing his cabinet and promising more reform. We will have new steps toward more democracy, he said, more freedom for citizens, new steps to reduce unemployment, to elevate the standard of living and improve services. It's unclear how many demonstrators and police have been injured or killed so far. We saw many succumb to tear gas. The protesters have now reached the main square here in downtown Cairo. People are being injured. We have seen several collapsing so far today, like this man. I don't think we can stay here any longer. As the day progressed, the protests began to change. A movement that started with students, human rights activists, and the unemployed turned increasingly Islamic. Shouts against President Mubarak merged with cries of Allahu Akbar, God is greater. They have now stopped for a moment of prayer. It is also an act of defiance, challenging the police to stop them. The Muslim Brotherhood, a group long banned here, says it joined the protests. Egypt has said it's cracking down to maintain order and to prevent the country from falling to Islamic radicals. As evening fell, police vehicles were attacked on bridges and set on fire. Mubarak imposed a curfew and for the first time called in the army. But when armored vehicles rolled into Cairo, they seemed to take no action against the demonstrators. In fact, crowds surrounded the military vehicles, climbed on top of them, cheered the soldiers, and called on them to join the movement. President Mubarak, Brian, has reshuffled his cabinet several times in the past. Protesters we spoke to tonight say this time it's not enough. Brian?
So, Richard, question is, what is this exactly? It is citizens and not like the black face mask people. I did see some people brought their children to see the protest today, families watching on balconies. But at the same time, as you reported, there is a religious aspect to it, so it's probably hard to guess endgame, what kind of society, government they would want if successful.
It's very hard to know because this is not a centrally organized protest. It began with the unemployed, students, people who have had enough of the corrupt system that has been in place in Egypt for a long time. But then, as the protests started to gain momentum, Islamic movements, the Muslim Brotherhood, which is by far the biggest underground organization in Egypt, started to become involved. And many people in this country are worried that if this protest continues and seriously topples the regime, the Muslim Brotherhood will try and make a run for power. Brian?
All right, Richard Engel. Richard, will come back to you for more of your reporting in Cairo. We want to go first to the White House, scurrying behind the scenes while the president stayed off television all day and intentionally kept a low profile. That changed tonight. Our chief White House correspondent, Chuck Todd, is at the White House with more on the president's response. Chuck, you and I were talking earlier. This puts the White House and the United States in a strange position.
It really does. And for much of the White House today, they were like us, watching everything they could get their hands on, whether it's Al Jazeera, Egyptian television, tracking down the same rumors we were all tracking down. They didn't have a lot of information. And then it was at a 4 o'clock meeting with his principals, and that includes Vice President Biden, Secretary Clinton, Bill Daley, his new chief of staff, Admiral Mullen, that the president decided he had to say something publicly. He had to call President Mubarak. That's when the whole thing set in motion. And here's a little bit of what the president shared with the public about his conversation with President Mubarak.
When President Mubarak addressed the Egyptian people tonight, he pledged a better democracy and greater economic opportunity. I just spoke to him after his speech, and I told him he has a responsibility to give meaning to those words, to take concrete steps and actions that deliver on that promise.
And Brian, you could see the tone change really throughout the day from the White House, both with Robert Gibbs' briefing, Secretary Clinton earlier, the president at night, where they're basically getting tougher and tougher and tougher on President Mubarak to the point where you heard them even threaten that foreign aid, Brian.
And again, what is a tough situation for them. All right, Chuck Todd at the White House, thanks. And we now want to talk about what's happening across a whole region. Remember, Tunisia, Algeria, Yemen, and Egypt, especially Egypt right now, puts the U.S. in this delicate position. We talk about foreign aid. Here's a figure. As much as $1.5 billion Egypt receives from the U.S. every year. NBC's Andrea Mitchell with us from our Washington newsroom tonight with more on how this day played out and how this crisis is playing out. Andrea, good evening.
Good evening, Brian. The uprising against Egypt's president created a crisis for President Obama because for decades under Democratic and Republican administrations, Mubarak has been America's closest ally in the Middle East. Even before the president spoke, as Hosni Mubarak began losing control of the streets, the U.S. had started toughening its response.
These protests underscore that there are deep grievances within Egyptian society. And the Egyptian government needs to understand that violence will not make these grievances go away.
The president had an extended intelligence briefing today, and until tonight did not even try to call Mubarak. For decades, Egypt has received billions in U.S. military and civilian aid, more than any country other than Israel. Currently, U.S. aid to Egypt is $1.5 billion a year. Today, the White House warned it could cut aid if the crackdown escalates.
We will be reviewing our assistance posture based on events that take place in the coming days.
In 2009, the president chose Cairo to call for more democracy in the Arab world.
Suppressing ideas never succeeds in making them go away.
But there has been little follow-up, say critics. Egypt has long been America's most reliable partner in the Middle East, and Mubarak a key ally against al-Qaeda.
He has been a bulwark in the area as a secular government in an area that is increasingly being dominated by more religious extremists.
So despite widespread fraud by Mubarak's party in Egypt's parliamentary elections last November, criticism from the U.S. was muted. As late as yesterday, Vice President Biden called Mubarak an important ally.
And I think that it would be, I would not refer to him as a dictator.
Now, after the government fell in Tunisia and a Hezbollah government took over Lebanon, are other pro-U.S. Arab leaders at risk?
And I think this thing has gone viral, and we're not seeing the end of it in Egypt. We're going to see it in Yemen. We're going to see it all over the Arab world now.
U.S. officials say that the question tonight is, does Mubarak genuinely understand the meaning of the demonstrations and initiate real reforms, or just try to manage the crisis? And from his speech tonight, U.S. officials are not encouraged. Brian?
Heard that expression go viral all day today, along with the expression a prairie fire, but we shall see. All these situations are different. Andrea Mitchell in our Washington newsroom. Thanks. As promised, let's go back to Richard Engel in Cairo. I should point out Richard lived and worked in Cairo for many years while starting out as a reporter. So, Richard, you know the place well, and if people were watching the pictures out of there today without the sound up, for example, it would look strange. There's clashes with police, yet not with the army. In this country, both of them are respected members of our society, but in Egypt, they're treated quite differently.
That's very true, Brian. I lived here for about 4 years, just starting out in journalism. I lived in a very poor neighborhood, and the police weren't popular then. They're not popular now. The people come into contact with the police all the time. Often they're unpleasant experiences, demanding petty bribes, shakedowns. The Army is a very different situation. The Army is not deployed in the cities. The soldiers are on bases, pretty much in the deserts on the outskirts of Cairo, and they're highly respected. So today, all of the violence was directed at the riot police and other forces associated with the Interior Ministry. When the Army moved in, the Egyptian protesters stepped back. They didn't want to fight the Army. They still don't want to fight the Army. And that, so far, is what's been holding the city together and keeping what little calm there is that remains right now.
I've also seen the protesters let civilian traffic go by. Their quarrel is not with their fellow citizens. And I've seen the Army surround and protect the Central Museum there that houses the great antiquities of Egypt.
That was a scene earlier today. First, Egyptians, just demonstrators and people who live in the area, formed a human chain around the museum. There had been some reports of looting in downtown. They didn't want anyone to go in and steal these priceless pharaonic antiquities. Then the Egyptian army moved in, put some armored vehicles around the main entrances, and people were very supportive of that.
All right, Richard Engel continuing his reporting in Cairo tonight. Richard, thanks. We talked about social media. One more word on that, specifically Twitter. This crisis spread like wildfire on Twitter and other services. We have a live feed up here now. You can look over my shoulder. These are all actually slower than real-time comments. Anyone who is leaving a Twitter comment, talking to each other on the subject of the uprising in Egypt, it's going that fast. There's that many of them. If anything, it's slowed down to accommodate all the traffic. And this is despite the fact that Egyptians shut down the internet there in Egypt. A British newspaper put together a graphic of internet traffic. You see it falls off a cliff when assuming, along with the cooperation of service providers, they shut off internet service, but resourceful people in this electronic age have found a way to communicate with the outside world nonetheless.